I guess we'll go ahead and get started. My name's Chris Palazzolo. I'm the head of collections at Emory University's Woodruff Library. My co-presenter is in another meeting, but he's going to come and join us towards the end of that meeting to assist with questions and so forth. So I will take the reins for the vast majority of this presentation. Lars Meyer is the we just had a big reorganization not too long ago, so I'm trying to remember his exact title right now, but it's Director of Resource Management and Access Services, which includes everything from ILL to cataloging to ECR and so forth. So what we're going to talk about today is really kind of, I'm calling this kind of colloquially a bit of a status check of sorts of where we are with shared print initiatives, which are not particularly overly new, but they're still definitely in a period of flux and a lot of decision making and a lot of questions and implications and consequences of those decisions are having to be managed and discussed. Lars just returned back from the Rosemont meeting just last week, which this obviously is one of its major, its major kind of initiative, and so he probably can answer more questions about his experience there. But we wanted to kind of look at it from a library's perspective, look at the challenges, opportunities that exist around shared print, at all the different scales that it's being discussed in. And then, particularly towards the end of the presentation, we'll look at a very specific example of ourselves, of Emory, and how we have addressed these multiple demands and multiple missions and different goals of shared print from the variety of sources, kind of how we've done in our experiences so far, our strategies, in other words. All right. So first, we go into the very basic definition, how we're kind of discussing it here. In terms of shared print being a formal agreement among libraries to retain and share specific titles. And this is where a lot of the, not say disagreement so much, but a lot of the discussion is as to which titles we want to maintain. And we'll kind of go a little more into detail about that in just a minute. Okay. There's been a lot of early shared collections work, but probably some of the most well-known ones were these OCL reports. And I may have the dates a little bit wrong here, but a lot of this began in 2010 or so. Really kind of imagining collections in the cloud and how to look at the distributions of collections, where they're sitting, the duplication amongst those collections, and so forth around the United States, and then looking a little bit more detail about that and looking at how we might manage that distribution at a mega scale, for example. Are there certain clusters of print materials and so forth? What does that mean for access to those materials? What does it mean? How many copies of materials are held in common and so forth? And then, whether shared print collections really, in this context, is really in the future consist of materials that are widely held, or is it really focused more on those materials that are unique? Or rarely used, and so forth, is again a question of kind of contention. Obviously, there are issues here that were mentioned here of cost of storage, the infrastructure, and delivery of those materials when needed, and how easily that's done. And so really a lot of the economics of shared print, one of the big statements made by a lot of these reports is that the kind of the political economy, of one might say, this comes from my political science background, of understanding, how we actually finance, support, and look at deliverables, and also pros and cons, and what kind of costs individual libraries as well as consortia have to undertake, and the burdens they have as libraries. All right, kind of doing this in two here. So kind of typical to a lot of shared print programs, we thought we might kind of focus a little bit of what we've seen over time of these. A lot of them are leveraging very existing networks, consortia that are already out there. So we're not really recreating a lot of infrastructure. A lot of times we're trying to use existing ones. Oftentimes built upon very less formal agreements. There was a great article in Against the Grain a few years ago that looked at what MOUs were like. Particularly on shared print and last copy agreements, and they ran the gamut from being really formal and prescriptive and very descriptive to being very kind of vague and allowing for a lot of maneuver. Oftentimes those are regional, but sometimes at national level. There's oftentimes a time-bound retention commitment in a lot of these agreements that we've noticed. And again, frequently based on these MOUs rather than on formal contracts, as one might call them. And most of them include some sort of aspect of interlibrary loans. This is really where the connection or linkage between collections and access becomes so important because of the relationship between these two factors. All right. So in recent years, we've definitely seen a huge increase in the number of these agreements, whether or not they be formal or informal. They're not entirely new, but increased attention has been on particularly the management of these, who is in charge of managing it, and how you do that virtually, what tools you have to do that. And that goes into infrastructure in terms of whether vendors are involved in this, in terms of solutions to try and manage the metadata issues, or try to look for duplication, what their involvement is, but also the cost of maintaining storage and of doing deduplication at the local level. The scale of these has been very much changed. There's some very small ones. We'll talk about this in a few minutes. Some very small initiatives that are very focused on specific geographic regions or specific types of materials or area studies, for example. Whereas there are others that are much more at a national, what we call a mega level, all right? And then there's a lot of discussion of the nature of materials retained. And this really gets to a lot of what the initial motivations were for moving into these shared print programs. Some of which were more about space and the needing to recapture space on campuses. Others were much focused more on preservation, on last copy, of materials. So sometimes deduplication was not a concern. In some cases it was. Okay. So a lot of discussion here is a lot of libraries are being asked, of course, or have been asked to participate in these programs. And so the question is really, what is leading to these motivations, and why would a library want to join one of these? This is another kind of trend we see in terms of trying to understand why or the kind of motivation. And some of these are long known, but some of these are some newer motivations. One of the ones that's been used the most often is collaborative, cooperative collection development, expanding the complexity and extent of a library's own individual collection by having access to other collections in areas that you may not be able to collect in for budgetary reasons, for space reasons, for what have you. Gap filling in those areas, particularly serial runs, print serial runs that you may or may not have. Managing down the collection, as I mentioned before, in terms of physical space and use and deduplication of that material. Active preservation of the scholarly record, kind of the major mission of libraries. So that goes into the next piece of supporting the mission of libraries. Growth of kind of the digital corpus is another one, particularly when we have such large digital corpuses. Do we need to keep physical manifestations on site and so forth? It made some of these decisions easier, in some cases made them more difficult. And also the role of HathiTrust and other organizations in shared print programs themselves as actors within that sphere. So not just management of a digital corpus, but also management of a physical corpus that mirrors the digital one. And then growth of ebook collections and greater access to content kind of goes into that. And that's for a lot of programs. So we think about shared print programs, we're often thinking of really large scale, low use materials, but we also seen a number of shared print programs that have come out because of because of a digital version and maybe a sharing of a particular print copy amongst a consortium, like a TRLN model, for example, where we don't need to have a print copy. Every library doesn't need to buy a print copy because we can share it because we have a digital surrogate, right? So this kind of goes into the variety of programs that we've been seeing kind of come up. The micro, macro, and mega, I call them here. So there are wide varieties of scale, potential overlap for these programs. A lot of question is, what is the ideal level of collaboration? Is it the regional level? Is it is it the state level? Is it the national level? And particularly the relationship between all those actors in managing kind of what we might consider to be a national shared print registry, for example, or other. All right, so we see here, and these are just examples of some here, everything from Rosemont, HathiTrust, the very recent one here, South Asia Cooperative. Our South Asian Studies librarian, for example, has been very heavily involved in identifying materials particularly in vernacular languages, South Asian languages, for preservation and for a shared print thing, so very minor. GPO Centers of Excellence is an early one as well, where certain libraries, some of you may already know these, particularly because it comes out of the Association of Southeast Research Libraries in terms of trying to maintain a corpus of print government documents or agency dedication of a particular institution. Right. There's just a little picture there. Some of the colors there didn't quite match up, so it's hard to kind of see some of those, but these are just the various ones, Scholars Trust and Hathi's Western Regional Storage Trust, et cetera, the Big Ten Alliance, all of which most people are familiar with. Right. So we want to go to a little bit about precedents, because we talk a lot about these shared print. We talk about that they're completely new. They've been going around for a while, but they've been talked about in very different ways or discussed in very different manners. All right. So, and traditionally, this is kind of what we thought in terms of kind of starting this discussion, that libraries really kind of collaborate and cooperate, something we've always done, working through ILL, consortial solutions to e-resources, as well as the print sources storage facilities. Georgia Tech and Emory have our own storage facility together, recap, et cetera. These are not particularly new things where we share expertise and so forth. But we also compete a lot for grant money, staffing, and other libraries or other institutions or groups on campus for that money and so forth. So all these can play important roles in how we have participated in the past and in the future for shared print. Okay. We also noticed there's some good parallels with open access in a lot of these issues, in that there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built here. And so this is something that a lot of libraries have already been, we can have a whole discussion, of course, and there have been many at this conference, about growth in open access and kind of pathways to open access. And but there's a lot of parallels, though, here, potential parallels with the shared print in terms of need to create a sustainable infrastructure, data model, pricing model for these, free rider issues in terms of those who can't participate, but those who benefit from shared print and so forth, who takes on the burden, for example, of the cost of all this, economies of scale, distribution of cost of burdens, and vendor solutions, which we've seen in terms of hybrid journals, in terms of other types of models for managing open access or incorporating open access into collection development, traditional collection development. So again, the point here is to show there's been a lot of activity, may not be, but a lot of activity in other areas that actually has very good parallels with the shared print. All right. There's a lot of parallels, obviously, with traditional preservation or conservation programs, and because these really have a lot of the same goals here in terms of interest, in ensuring access to library resources. They're very sensitive to our own collection development policies. There's funding issues, documentation about the materials we preserve and why, tracking of that, working with stakeholders to identify the priorities and so forth. And this is what I'm talking about, is something that's very traditional, sort of just, for everything from brittle books to microfilm, et cetera. A good parallel that my colleague Lars Meyer, who used to be the chief preservation officer for Emory, he was very much involved in a lot of these old microfilm projects, which in themselves were shared, not so much print, but definitely were collaborations in trying to preserve the scholarly record and keeping a more permanent copy of materials that were brittle or that were rare or unique. There was a lot of, from the National Humanities brittle books, the RLG Great Collections, if some of you may remember those. And this was a model that worked pretty well because there were standards, there were thoroughness, good cataloging was a requirement. This was a reliable surrogate that would last over time and so forth. And there was funding from a lot of national agencies for that. So if some of you remember, actually you wanted me to mention this, some of you remember there was this old film from, I believe it was from, I forget who actually did it, from Slow Fires, which is an old film particularly that has a very iconic end of moment and it's about the historical record and the role that libraries play and all of that and so forth. But this was very much just a good model, again, to kind of look at or refer back to. Folks think microfilm is outdated and so forth, but this is actually in terms of the operationalization and implementation of these grants, these creation or execution of these collections on microfilm. They really kind of were following a similar approach, some of which have grown, which are still lacking, I should say, in shared print, but are kind of growing in importance and in needing to address them. The last one big one that we have here is last copy agreements. And last copy agreements were oftentimes set at the state level, where you had multiple copies of the same materials, a lot of materials held in common, and the set kind of criteria for retention, deaccessioning of that material, who would hold it, ensuring that there is at least one copy of a particular work held by one library that was available to all for priority lending, et cetera, leveraging existing networks that we mentioned earlier, and so forth. And again, was another way, a kind of primary goal here of allocating space in terms of deaccessioning needs and creating space savings and so forth, all right? They didn't really address a lot of these long-term collection management requirements or issues. Again, these are mostly a lot about motivations on space and on managing access to materials over time. It very much depends on the state. And again, like these other MOUs, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of variety in terms of how explicit they are and how detailed they are in terms of their motivations and in terms of their long-term management. So there definitely is variety in that area. Oops. All right. And the other one I mentioned to you before, that is kind of another, it's not really so much a precedent as it's something that's kind of been going on for a little while, but it still has a nice parallel here, as I mentioned before, in terms of shared print. And this is a more perspective in nature, and this is a little bit more about collection development as opposed to collection management. But they do not, these are not things that are concerning old legacy collections. These are things that are managing new purchases, particularly leveraging ebooks as a way to share material as opposed to having a print copy. And this is really done on a very much a publisher by publisher basis for agreements in terms of sharing ebooks. So the arrangements are at the consortial level to purchase or keep one print copy, particularly in storage, not even on the shelf sometimes, which is then shared amongst members. Okay. So the next piece I want to talk about, and that kind of doesn't show so good on the gray there, operational realities. So I want to really focus about kind of the impacts that these are on library operations themselves. So we've talked a lot about, in this case, what kind of the major goals are, what the precedents for a lot of these activities are, and what have you. Kind of wanted to think about where we have the impacts are on our kind of everyday work for libraries. One of the questions is, when does this need to get done by? Is it 2025? Is it 2020? So, et cetera. Everything is moving very quickly. Space continues to be at a premium in a lot of libraries. There's significant variety in language and requirements, validation of what's on the shelf, for example, metadata, completeness or comprehensiveness, holdings records that are not complete, so forth. Disclosure to other libraries who may need to be making decisions on their own collections, needing to know who has what and what they can and cannot either discard, withdraw from their collections. All right. There's a lot of balancing that has to be done about all of this, and in terms that libraries have to consider in terms of the cost they're willing to take on, what they're willing to add on to the infrastructure for this, whether or not they should be involved in smaller initiatives, whether or not smaller libraries could depend on consortial arrangements to speak on their behalf. Are those better for them than for them to be, because they may not have the capacity locally to really be heavily involved, all right? Big discussions, particularly of libraries, of what to retain, over-retention versus just enough. What's the minimum number of copies? The duplication across multiple groups. Are we just creating more duplication? Are we creating duplication, still creating duplication just amongst different big consortial groups? Or is there a magic number for that? I don't have an answer for that, but just that's a consideration to keep in mind. So there are a lot of responsibilities libraries have in this realm in terms of their own cataloging materials, verification on the shelf, as I mentioned before, looking at their relationships with interlibrary loan networks, metadata creation and interaction with vendor tools, local curation and selection of materials, coordination with your own umbrella groups and consortia, and also preservation and conservation, looking at conditions for where the materials are going to be stored, for example, whether or not you have a high density storage facility, how good actually are the books you have that you're retaining? Are they actually able to be actually circulated, or are there better copies out there? Just because you have a copy does not mean it is the best copy, per se. All right. So these are just a few constraints related to participation, staffing capacity, the physical validation we mentioned, and all these things take staffing, all these things take time to get done and so forth. And we have at consortial level, at the national level, it depends whether or not we even think this is whether your library director thinks this is an issue, whether or not it's something you're going to actually put staffing and resources into, or you just, or is this something you just cannot handle with other priorities that need to take precedent, right? One thing I'm particularly interested in is the selection of materials, simply because we've seen a lot of cases is over-retention. How many copies are really necessary, and also is there an over-retention of certain titles at the without really realizing the unique materials? What should the focus really be? There was a presentation just the other day. We're talking about Ohio Link's approach to a lot of duplication in their multiple storage facilities, and what their approach was in terms of looking at the unique materials rather than trying to deduplicate all the materials that were available across the Ohio Link network. All right. Again, distribution of burden, kind of talked about that a little bit overrun. And particularly also rare editions or versions. Again, what really is conceived as the best copy of a material? Is it, and what considers to be a unique copy? Could there be 4 different copies of work X, one with marginalia, one with some extra, something makes it unique, particular edition, and so forth? Again, standards are particularly important in this case. All right. Monographs versus serials have different obligations and responsibilities, of course. Holding records, for example, that have to be verified, as opposed to monographs, although multi-volume works and series can be just as complicated sometimes as your friendly serial. All right. Cataloging metadata, minimum expectations, what is a good record, what is the minimum standard for the record in order to be findable, discoverable, and so forth. All right. This is an area that's getting a lot of activity right now with OCLC and others. People are familiar with green glass in terms of making participation notices more clear or clearer to other libraries and making their own decisions as they do analyses of their collections and collection assessment. Standardized language for this in a 583 action note, for example, how long you're preserving a particular material, where it's located, so forth, the what and who of your decisions that can be viewed by other libraries and so forth. Clarity on your holdings, and again, how do you fill in gaps, who is responsible for those gaps, and so forth. And again, go back to that physical validation and preservation piece. Okay. Finally, before we go into the Emory kind of approach, we have rules for vendors, kind of incorporation of standard print retention commitments, copy condition quality. How do we mark those things or record those things in a standardized, systematic fashion? How long, in terms of maintenance of commitments, additions and deletions, and just general disclosure of all those things. And a lot of these things involve a ton of interrelationships between different groups. But this is definitely a space where there's been a lot of activity in terms of how we can be assisted by, but also help direct vendors in terms of assisting us in the best way forward in terms of these issues or responsibilities or costs that we have associated with shared print. Okay. And finally, preservation access. What is the optimal geographic distribution? Are we okay with things getting lost? Lars likes to put this in because when you start circulating items, are we sure that we're taking it at risk, or if there's a certain minimum number of copies that will alleviate that concern? Okay. And finally, role of offsite storage. This is a particularly interesting issue because the fact is in about selection of materials. So one thing, for example, that Emory did when we were asked to be a member of the HathiTrust shared print phase 1, we said, well, what materials are we going to select to be that? We were very deliberate in the fact that we only picked materials that are currently in our LSC, which is our Library Service Center that we share with Georgia Tech, and that we, because those materials were not going to ever be not ever, but more than likely not be withdrawn from the materials. They'd already gone through deduplication with Georgia Tech as well before they actually moved in to the LSC. And they had all been very well cataloged. We had a catalog, kind of a collection prep project, so the cataloging records were really good for these, and so forth, for findability locally, but also nationally through other networks. And that didn't leave us a whole ton of unique, and also we looked at a number of libraries that held these materials, and that didn't really leave us a whole ton of materials, but we felt much more assured of those materials and being able to commit to those rather than sharing tons of things that are in our stacks, or things that were other widely held. So it was a very deliberate decision. So, it is however, for deduplication purposes, as I mentioned before, across libraries, that is probably a downside in terms of the fact that when you try to dedupe a high-density storage facility, you're not really meant to do that, per se, because when you touch one object, it affects many other objects in that box, and so forth, and there's a whole inventory system, there are implications for that, all right? So we're all just kind of being concerned about how we all sent the same low-use materials to storage, or are we really kind of focusing more on the unique, okay? There's a role of digital surrogates here. This is looking at the digitized legacy collections, the state and national digital newspaper products, and what is really the role of digital surrogates and all this shared print, in terms of, are we just going to see such a low use in print now on that we don't need to worry about some of these print physical materials? Are they equivalents? Can we use them? And so on. This is a much larger discussion about digitization, of course, and so on. And that there are actually a lot of, in terms of e-preservation, there are a ton of other archives, clocks, and Portico that a lot of people are already familiar with. We won't focus too much on this, just to note that these are other kind of preservation efforts for the e-resources, but that we can kind of look as models too, okay? There are implications for ILL, of course, cost associated with being a net lender, whether or not there's sufficient metadata, and so forth. And sometimes it's not actually really sensible to really go within the program. We go to other places to find the same material. What is the best leveraging of our existing networks? Okay, who pays to support the infrastructure? Pretty important. Obviously, we keep coming back to that, but I think it's a pretty important point to make known. All right. So let's talk for this last little minute so I can allow some time for a few questions. This is Emory Strategies right now. I already mentioned one in the aspect of looking at how we participate in HathiTrust. We have been, just as a lot of folks have had with open access initiatives, we've kind of been bombarded with a lot of, can you participate in this? What would, Emory should be a member of this, et cetera, and so forth. And we, are trying to manage, locally, what can we handle and so forth in terms of staffing, infrastructure, management of our holdings, and how we work with either vendor solutions or consortial solutions, such as ACERL, for example, that manages its GRNL database for gaps and stuff in print serials holdings. So we've got how we mentioned the HathiTrust Shared Print. We're a member of ACERL Scholars Trust. Interesting, this was based on a subject librarian selection of journals that were meant to retain. And interesting to note here is that it's not uncommon for some libraries within this ACERL to be really highly concentrated proportionally. For example, Florida's FLAIR has a much bigger piece of this, probably like 30-something%, where some other libraries is a long tail of 1 or 2% of titles in total Scholars Trust that are being held by those other libraries. So there's kind of an undue burden there, may not undue, but definitely unequal. We're looking at the, as I mentioned before, the South Asian, one of our South Asian Studies librarian. And finally, there's our shared collection with Georgia Tech, which is a shared print collection. It actually also includes our stacks. So folks there can, at Georgia Tech or at Emory, have access to materials held by both libraries through a fulfillment network, which is in our ALMA instance. There's priority lending, and there's document delivery, and so forth. A lot of deduplication efforts were made before moving materials in. General materials and then specialized materials, such as our FDLP materials, which have obviously different restrictions on what we can and can't do with those, and so forth, in terms of needs and offers, and so forth, people who are FDLP libraries or selective depositories. So we definitely have that issue in mind. But this is on a very small scale. This is really to create a shared collection. And we do have an MOU in place for this in terms of kind of prospectively, but also retrospectively, we had an MOU in terms of what materials we would bring in. There was an agreement, for example, that if there any duplication in serials, for example, that I believe that tech kept the serials with a better run and better copies, whereas Emory kept monographs where there was a better, assuming that we had the better copy of the monograph. Okay. There definitely was all that in process. It was done with it was a pretty long process, so there was a lot of documentation around this. But there's also an MOU for prospective collection building as well that is in place, but primarily focuses on a lot of e-resources as opposed to print. So that's a little different. Okay. All right, well, I'm going to end it at that. And that was a very fast through Emory. I'm happy to answer any questions about kind of Emory's kind of approach to this. But really, just to kind of conclude, what Lars and I had wanted really to accomplish with this presentation is really kind of take a step back about shared print, look at the different responsibilities and implications, as I mentioned before, in terms of what this means for individual libraries as they are considering or thinking about being a member, either individually through a consortium at a national level, and so forth, because these things do have real costs and real, and not just costs in terms of actual money, but also in terms of staffing and in terms of priorities and where you want to put where you want to have your staff work on in terms of, let's say, adding and updating records, for example. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm happy to take any questions, try to answer them to my best ability, and if not, hopefully we'll have Lars, I'll pass them on to Lars as well. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Aaron. You're part of the HathiTrust.
Yes, we are part of the HathiTrust Shared Print. Mm-hmm.
And you're working what percentage of your place?
What percentage of for our thing with Georgia Tech?
Or both
combined, we didn't deaccession much of anything, honestly. Our FDLP, we did deaccession a lot of that because of needs and offers and so forth and changes, but because everything was moving into storage, we decided not to do a big, huge deaccessioning project at the same time because we had the benefit of a much larger space with multiple modules to grow. It's exactly what we did, yes. And they moved about 90% of their collection over, about 95%, huge amounts, whereas probably, I can't remember the percentage right now, but it was a minimal compared to what they did. We were probably moving most of our stuff that was already in storage over to storage, whereas they're moving most of the materials that were on site into storage. So, yeah. And they benefited, I will say, we benefit a lot more from the space, because we really needed the space, and they benefit a lot from the shared collection because there's a lot of gaps in terms of their holdings that they don't buy a lot of print materials, and particularly in their liberal arts curricula, which they don't have as much strong support in. That's where they benefit a lot of their library patrons do. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. We have not made a definitive no to anybody. There's still ones where we're in the consideration phase, I will say, as opposed to we did not, I'd say one we did not do actually was the Centers of Excellence, which is another ACERL project, which is the one that focuses on government documents, which was the preservation of a lot of materials where you would take on an agency and be really the hub for that agency and provide reference assistance, provide, interlibrary loan, et cetera, for that. We did not have the staffing. Our depository, I'm the depository coordinator. It's like 10% less than that of my time. We didn't have the staffing that would be involved in terms of getting more of those materials because there's a lot of asking folks for materials so they could deaccession their materials and that you would house them and so forth. So that's one we definitely did not because, again, it was a capacity issue that we could not take on. And that wasn't a big future priority for us at the time. Yes, sir. Yeah, it's a lot. Trust me, it hurts my head.
I'm using the slide that you shared that content is on that.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that a lot of shared learnings
Definitely.
I wonder if, in doing a survey, you found that any shared print programs were looking at using conditions as criteria for
Yeah, I haven't really looked specifically at that particular, I think it's an extremely important point, that the whole idea of condition and physical copy. There have been some validation studies, that's as much as I know in terms of being sure things are on the shelf, but the condition of that material that's on the shelf is a completely different question. Just because it's there, it's great, but if you can't really do much of it, it's going to fall apart, because it's 1960s paper that's, really bad, that's a different issue, yeah. Uh,
because we're safe with going east to eastern access.
mhm.
We did our validation study, it was part of that population.
Great, okay.
So when we went in, it's statistically significant, but we didn't examine every item because we were about to retain 30% of our collection for the way. So we looked at, it was a lot, 10,000. And they give us a form, it was all, is this, it will be something out. If one is an optional, two, it is, what's the
Great, okay.
then they came up with a, based on that, they use that statistically.
Kind of like a sampling in a sense, a representative sample of what you had. Sure, sure.
I wonder though if I can follow up. I think in general questions, we have a different idea of what condition means versus our thoughts and our
Mm-hmm.
because, in the preservation versus access binary, we get a
Sure.
What we in the past is that it would be duplicating or creating scarcely,
Sure.
creating special collections. So the community moves us, these copies of these have to be all these resources. We need to identify stuff that's artifacts are significant, whether that's marginalia, like we mentioned before, maybe copper that we created,
Yeah, yeah.
whether in this final seven items, this one here is supposed to be as published state
As
we
again.
got the six, rebound, or part of that.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if there's what you or anybody else thinking about how we can maybe start to think about.
I don't have an answer, but I think it's a great question.
Yeah, there's a little bit of built-in, getting some of these final agreements built in, a little bit of that. It's got to be on some places. Again, when you're talking about the scope and scale of the collection.
Yeah.
Other than as you come across those things, or so if I come across something that I know is a change, and that would be a good transfer. Whatever.
Yeah.
It really should be in our special collection. The Consortial bids are set up so that we can actually transfer that.
Yeah.
See, or if I do find that it needs to be damaged out, then I make a decision on that. It's just really the damage we need to reject our.
I'll say the HathiTrust agreement is pretty good in terms because it involved all the major, the librarians involved. We're doing a lot more work about that. I can't remember top of my head all the specific parameters of it, but it was trying to address transfer that struck my mind because I remember that was a line in there as well about. Yeah.
The biggest challenge that I've seen is that because of this, we're talking about is a lot of times just because something is scarce doesn't mean it's valuable. And so we got, I have the perfect example before the state did. 35 years ago, we had a language program, and it's been gone for 30 years. We still had the print collection back on the shelf.
Mhm. Sure. Yeah. Sorry, you got it. I think you had a question over here, sir. Did you have a question? Okay, oh, sorry.
I had a question about removing items from circulation.
Mhm.
We find some
Sure. Yeah, yeah. We have a certain number of agreements with our special collections and archives about moving those in. I don't know if we're being as careful as we should be in terms of looking at the agreements in which we signed about doing that. We have a local process for doing that. If things are identified in the collection that we think would be much better up in, I think we've gotten most of them out, but we still find some here and there about those things. So we have not really, but I have to double check our retention agreements to see where that sits, in that whether or not, because now it's going to no longer be able to be retained or circulated the same way that it would be now in terms of a special collections. Although I know there's a lot of arguments now about a lot of discussion now about better sharing of special collections materials and so forth and so on. So that's another, my archival friends will always remind me of that. That discussion is still a little nascent, but it's happening, which is really good. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Okay. This one's it's seen better days.
Yeah, this one is broken, but it's worked for the moment. And it's shelved accordingly in our library. We're so stacked, so we don't have to see one anyway. But we do have these extra uses, how they get presented for longevity, and we calculate that into the new agreement collection.
Oh.
And how long they will be.
Unhappy book. Really. Yeah, more people actually use the catalog. Maybe, yeah. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
The one thing that also I'd like to watch out for where catalog is monograph, clearly not monographs.
Mm.
That can be problematic.
Sure.
So as you're doing things, but also doing potential lists of employee agreements that
Sure.
rectify that.
Yeah, cataloging practices, other things that were miscatalogued, et cetera, all those sort of things. Yeah, exactly.
Single issues and serial special issues.
Serial special, analyze serials,
So monograph,
yeah.
there are things that are monographs, broadly, with reports and stuff like that. So
That's a good point, yeah.
stuff we put in bank boxes and keep it stored they agree to retain it, take it for everyone else, so they don't have to.
To keep that same stuff. Exactly. Well, I think we're out of time. So thank you, everyone, very much for coming. Appreciate it.